The first thing the parents noticed was not Ethan Miller. It was the Mustang. It rolled into the private school parking lot a little after 10 on Saturday morning, coughing once through its old exhaust as if it already knew it had entered the wrong world. On both sides of the driveway sat machines that looked less like cars and more like statements. A black Lamborghini with mirror-bright doors, a white Porsche parked across two lines, a pearl Escalade with chrome wheels tall enough to reflect the sky. Then came Ethan's faded Rangoon red 1965 Mustang Coupe, its paint burned thin by 60 years of sun, its passenger fender patched in dull primer, its windshield cloudy at the corners, and its lower quarter panels freckled with rust. Ethan eased the Mustang into the last open space beside the donor tent and shut off the engine before it could embarrass him with one more rough idle. He was 38, lean from work, with tired eyes, short dark hair, and hands that never looked fully clean, no matter how long he washed them. In the passenger seat, his 10-year-old son, Noah, held a small red toy Mustang in both hands. The toy had been his mother's last birthday gift to him before she passed, and Noah had carried it so often that one of the tiny wheels no longer spun straight. He looked out at the rows of luxury cars, then at their old coupe, and for a moment he did not open his door. Across the parking lot, Vivian Cross turned before Ethan had even stepped out. She was standing with two other parents near the registration table, dressed in a cream-colored suit that looked expensive without trying to, her hair polished, her sunglasses resting on her head like a crown. Vivian was not just another parent at Ashford Preparatory. She was the CEO of Cross Elite Motors, the lead sponsor of the school's spring charity event, and the kind of donor administrators greeted with both hands. She looked at Ethan's Mustang, then at the small oil dark stain on the pavement beneath its rear main area, and her mouth bent into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I thought the Caterers parked around the back," she said. The parents near her laughed because Vivian Cross had laughed first. One of them, Blake Harlan, a real estate investor with a watch bigger than Noah's toy car, lifted his coffee cup toward the Mustang. "Nice museum piece," he said. "Does it come with tetanus shots, or is that extra?" Someone behind him snorted. Someone else glanced at Noah and looked away too late. Ethan heard every word, but he did not move quickly. He opened his door, stepped out, and gave the old Mustang's roof a gentle pat, the way a man might quiet an old dog that had done nothing wrong. Noah climbed out slowly. He was wearing his clean blue polo, the one Ethan had ironed twice that morning, because the first time he left a crease near the collar. He tucked the toy Mustang against his chest and closed the passenger door carefully, but not carefully enough to stop a flake of red paint from falling near his sneaker. Vivian saw it. Her smile widened. "A school event is not a junkyard, Mr. Miller," she said, loud enough for the registration volunteers to hear. "We have donors arriving all morning." Ethan took Noah's event wristband from the volunteer, nodded once, and said, "We were invited." That answer did not satisfy Vivian. It did not flatter her, and it did not apologize. Her eyes moved from Ethan's work boots to the Mustang's cracked driver's seat, visible through the window. "I am sure you were," she said. "I am only asking that we keep a certain standard. People notice things." Noah lowered his head. His small red toy Mustang disappeared from view as he slipped it into his pocket, not because he was finished playing with it, but because he suddenly understood that adults could make even a toy feel poor. For a moment, Ethan almost responded. The words came close. He could have said that he had fixed cars owned by men richer than Blake. He could have said that Vivian's dealership had once called him for advice, without admitting it. He could have said that his son did not deserve to be taught shame in a school parking lot. Instead, he looked at Noah, then at the Mustang. When Noah had climbed out, his shoe had nudged a bit of loose gravel under the passenger fender, exposing a narrow strip where the old paint had chipped away. Beneath the red and primer was a small hand-painted inspection mark, faded yellow, tucked under the fender lip where no casual owner would notice it. Ethan's expression changed for only half a second. It was not excitement, it was recognition. He crouched, pretending to tie Noah's shoelace, and brushed his thumb once under the fender. The mark was old, not decorative, not from a hobbyist restoration. Factory handwork had a certain carelessness to it, a kind of rushed confidence that modern shops tried to imitate and usually overdid. Ethan had seen marks like that years ago, back when he worked in a restoration shop that handled cars with armed guards and non-disclosure agreements. He stood up without speaking, and rested his palm against the fender, covering the mark from view. Vivian misread his silence as embarrassment. "Security can help you move it later," she said, "preferably before the auction photos." Blake laughed again, but quieter this time, because Ethan had not given him anything to fight with. Noah looked up at his father and whispered, "Dad, do they think we don't belong here?" Ethan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and gave the smallest squeeze. "No, son," he said. "Some people just don't know what they're looking at." Before the story continues, take a second to remember someone who was judged by what they drove, what they wore, or what they could not afford. If you re-listening from a city, a small town, a garage, a truck stop, or a kitchen table, this story is for you. Tell us where you re-listening from, because quiet people carry more than most people can see. Inside the school courtyard, the event looked like something built to erase ordinary life. White tents lined the grass. A jazz trio played near the silent auction tables. Parents balanced paper plates of catered salmon bites while discussing property values, tech stocks, vacation rentals, and private coaching for children who were not yet old enough to choose their own shoes without help. Noah's class had a booth where students threw beanbags at painted wooden targets, and the banner above it read, "Future Leaders Fundraiser." Ethan paid for 3 tickets with folded bills from his wallet and handed them to Noah. "Go have fun," he said. "I'll be right here." Noah did not go far at first. He stayed close to Ethan, watching the other kids run between booths with easy confidence. Ethan stood near the lemonade table, holding a cup he had not wanted, while 2 fathers beside him discussed a commercial real estate deal in Scottsdale. Blake Harlan drifted over, smiling as if the parking lot had been a joke between friends and not a blade slipped under a child's ribs. "Ethan, right?" he said. "You Noah's dad. Still fixing cars?" Ethan nodded. "That's right." Blake looked toward the parking lot where the Mustang was barely visible between a Porsche and an Escalade. "Must be tough," he said in the tone rich men use when they want sympathy to sound like superiority. "It keeps the lights on," Ethan said. Blake chuckled. "Well, if you ever want to learn about real investing, let me know. You can T-wrench forever." Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice as though he were doing Ethan a kindness. "And between us, you may want to park a little farther out next time." Vivian is particular about presentation. These fundraisers matter. Ethan looked past him at Noah, who had finally joined 2 boys near the beanbag booth. One of them said something Ethan could not hear. The other pointed toward the parking lot. Noah's shoulders changed. They did not slump all the way, but a father who has watched a child grieve learns to read the smallest collapse. Ethan set down his lemonade. "Excuse me," he said. Blake was still talking when Ethan walked away. Near the booth, Noah was staring at the ground while the 2 boys pretended not to have said anything. Ethan did not confront them. He had learned that embarrassing children in return only taught his own son the wrong lesson. He knelt beside Noah and picked up one of the beanbags. "Show me your throw," he said. Noah shook his head. "They said our car looks like it came from a junkyard." Ethan nodded slowly, not because the words were acceptable, but because pretending they did not hurt would insult them both. "Maybe it did," Ethan said. "A lot of good things come from places people stop looking." Noah glanced toward the parking lot. "Is it really junk?" he asked. Ethan smiled a little. "No." "Then why does everyone say it is?" Ethan turned the beanbag in his hand, feeling the cheap stitching between his fingers. 4 years earlier, his wife Grace would have answered first. She would have found a way to make Noah laugh and think at the same time. Grace had believed in old things, stubborn people, and furniture left on curbs. She used to tell Ethan, "Value does he always arrive polished." He had not repeated that line much since she died. Some memories felt too fragile to carry into daylight, because rust is easy to see, Ethan said. Worth takes longer. Noah accepted the beanbag and threw it. He missed the target completely, but Ethan clapped anyway. Across the courtyard, Vivian was watching them with a look of managed impatience. Beside her stood Principal Dana Whitcomb, who kept glancing between Vivian and the donors arriving through the gate. Vivian said something to the principal, then pointed toward the parking lot. Ethan saw the gesture, and he knew the old Mustang had not finished being a problem for people who did not own it. The next sound that changed the morning did not come from Ethan's car. It came from a black European SUV near the valet lane. Its owner, a parent named Prestonvale, had climbed in to move it for a photographer, but when he pressed the start button, the dashboard lit up and the engine refused to turn. The SUV clicked once, then flashed warnings across the screen. Preston tried again. Nothing. A valet leaned through the window and said something unhelpful. Two fathers gathered. Blake wandered over with the confidence of a man who could identify engine problems by invoice size. Probably electrical, he said, which meant almost nothing, and sounded expensive enough to impress the people nearby. Ethan heard the click from across the courtyard. He did not rush. He did not announce himself. He only looked once at Noah, who gave him a tiny nod because he knew that sound meant his father had already solved half of it. Ethan walked to the SUV and stood a few feet back. Preston looked up irritated. "Can I help you?" he asked. Ethan pointed at the open hood. "Your negative terminal is loose, or the security relay thinks it is. It is getting enough power to complain, not enough to crank." Blake smirked. "That is a pretty specific guess from a parking lot." Ethan did not answer him. He asked the valet for a napkin, folded it twice, and used it to nudge the battery cover aside without smearing grease on the polished trim. The negative terminal moved under the lightest pressure. Ethan tightened the clamp with the small pocket tool he carried on his key ring, then tapped the relay housing once and told Preston to try again. The SUV started immediately, not after a dramatic struggle, not after a speech. It simply came alive, smooth and expensive, as if the problem had never existed. The small group went silent. It was not a big silence, not the kind that fills a courtroom or a church. It was the quick, uncomfortable silence of people who had just watched a man they dismissed do something useful before they had time to charge him for it. Preston blinked, then said, "Well, thank you." Ethan nodded and stepped back. No, watching from the beanbag booth, stood a little taller. Blake cleared his throat. "Lucky guess," he said. Vivian arrived just in time to hear that and chose to believe it. "Mr. Miller," she said, her smile now thinner, "please don't turn my school fundraiser into a repair lot." Ethan wiped his hands on the napkin. "I didn't charge anyone. That isn't the point." Vivian said, "We have liability concerns." Preston, whose SUV was now running because of the man. Vivian was scolding, looked down and pretended to check a message. That was the thing Ethan had learned about certain rooms. People would accept your help as long as it did not require them to defend you. Noah saw it too, and that hurt Ethan more than Vivian's words. He had spent 4 years trying to teach his son that dignity was not the same as pride. But days like this made dignity look expensive. At the edge of the courtyard, an older man in a navy jacket watched the exchange without joining it. He had arrived late, carrying no visible sign of wealth except his calm. His hair was silver, his shoes were practical, and the old watch on his wrist looked worn enough to have stories. Most parents had not noticed him because he had not arrived in anything dramatic. He had parked near the street in an older Volvo and walked in alone, but Vivian had noticed him the moment he entered. Her posture changed. She excused herself from the principal and moved toward him with the smooth urgency of someone greeting money that did not like to be rushed. "Mr. Beckett." Vivian said warmly, "Harold. I'm so glad you made it." Harold Beckett shook her hand, but his eyes moved past her toward the parking lot. "I almost didn't," he said. "Traffic on Maple was backed up." Vivian laughed politely. "We saved time for you after the student auction. I think you'll be very pleased with what my classic division prepared." Harold gave a non-committal nod. "I am here as a parent first," he said. "My granddaughter is singing with the 4th grade." Vivian's smile held, but barely. "Of course, family first." Harold began walking toward the refreshment tent, then stopped. His head turned slightly, not toward the stage, not toward Vivian, but toward the narrow view of the parking lot between the tents. The old Mustang sat there in its assigned shame. Red paint dull under the sun, one hubcap missing the shine of the others, the passenger fender wearing its primer patch like a bruise. Harold's expression did not change in any obvious way, but his body did. He became still. For one brief second he looked like a man hearing his name called by someone long dead. Vivian followed his gaze and frowned. "I apologize for that," she said. "We rehandling it." Harold did not answer. He started walking again, but not toward the stage. He moved toward the parking lot. Ethan saw him coming from the courtyard entrance. Noah was now at his side again, holding a paper cup of lemonade with both hands. Vivian trailed behind Harold, trying to redirect him with conversation about student programs and donor plaques. But the older man walked straight to the Mustang. He stopped at the passenger side, about 3 feet away, close enough to see the cracked rubber around the vent window and the old factory seams beneath the tired paint. He did not laugh. He did not wrinkle his nose. He looked at the car the way Ethan had looked at the fender mark, quietly, carefully, almost respectfully. "Whose Mustang is this?" Harold asked. The question carried across the small space. Blake, who had followed out of curiosity, smiled as if another joke had arrived. "Belongs to our mechanic friend here," he said, though I used the word Mustang generously. Vivian shot him a look, not because she disagreed, but because Harold's face had become unreadable. Ethan stepped forward. "It's mine," he said. Harold looked at him fully for the first time. "You re the owner?" "Yes, sir. Not just working on it for someone, no. Title S in my name." Harold nodded once. "Where did you get it?" Ethan hesitated, not because the answer was secret, but because there are questions that feel different depending on who asks them. "Estate sale outside Mill Creek," he said. "Old mechanic passed. His nephew sold off the storage units." Harold's eyes moved to the hood gaps, then to the passenger fender. "How long ago?" 6 months. "Have you changed the engine?" "No." "Transmission?" "No." "Passenger fender?" Ethan glanced at Vivian, then back at Harold. "No. It was patched before I got it." Harold took that in like a doctor, hearing a symptom that confirmed something he feared. Vivian stepped closer. "Harold, I am not sure Mr. Miller wants to be interrogated at a school event." Her voice was light, but her eyes had sharpened, "and we really do need that vehicle moved." Harold ignored the second sentence. "May I look at the VIN?" he asked Ethan. Blake laughed under his breath. "Harold, if you were buying junkers now, I've got a shed full of old lawn equipment." Harold did not look at him. Ethan studied the older man's face and saw no mockery there, only urgency held behind manners. "You can look," Ethan said, "but don't touch the plate." That sentence changed the air between them. Harold's eyes lifted. "You know enough to say that." Ethan gave a small shrug. "I know enough not to let strangers lean on old rivets." For the first time all morning, Harold almost smiled. He crouched near the windshield pillar, careful to keep his hands to himself. Vivian folded her arms. Blake leaned over his shoulder, more curious now than amused. Noah stood beside Ethan, gripping his lemonade so tightly the paper cup bent. Harold read the VIN once. Then again, his face lost color so subtly that only Ethan noticed at first. He shifted lower, looking through the windshield at the dash stamp, then stood and moved to the passenger fender. "You said the engine has not been changed?" he asked, "as far as I can tell." "Original block," Ethan said. "Early casting. Not pretty, but right." Harold exhaled through his nose. "Have you ever taken this to a dealership?" Vivian's head turned toward Ethan before he could answer. Ethan nodded. "Cross Elite Motors, 3 months ago." Vivian's expression tightened. "My company?" "Your classic division," Ethan said. "I needed a small part and asked if they could help identify some markings." Blake looked delighted, and Ethan looked at him. "They told me it was a tired coupe with sentimental value." Vivian recovered quickly. "Then I'm sure that assessment was accurate. Our people are very qualified." Ethan did not argue. He reached through the open driver window, popped the glove box, and removed a brittle manila envelope held together by a rubber band so old it had gone pale. Harold saw the envelope and became even more still. "What is that?" he asked. "Came with the car," Ethan said. "Estate receipt, storage paperwork, a few notes. I haven't sorted all of it yet." That was not entirely true. He had sorted enough to know the car had secrets, but not enough to claim what they were. Life with Noah did not leave many late nights for chasing mysteries, and Ethan had been careful not to build hope on something he could not prove. He held the envelope against his chest, not defensively, but protectively. Vivian noticed that too. Her eyes flicked from the envelope to Harold's face, and for the first time that morning, she seemed less concerned with school image than with control. "This is becoming inappropriate," Vivian said. "We have children present, donors arriving, and an unverified vehicle in a school parking lot. Dana should have security remove it until we know there are no safety or title issues." Ethan looked at her. "Title issues? I am saying we don't know," Vivian replied. "You just admitted you bought it from an estate sale. These things can be messy. Abandoned vehicles. Improper transfers, altered plates. For everyone's protection, it should be moved off campus." Noah looked up sharply. He understood enough words to hear danger. The Mustang was not just a car to him. It was Saturday mornings with his father. It was the sound that filled the garage when the house felt too quiet. It was the toy in his pocket and the stories Ethan told him when grief sat at the dinner table like an extra chair. "Dad," he whispered, "can they take it?" Ethan put a hand on his shoulder. "No," he said, and this time his voice carried something the morning had not heard from him yet, not anger. Certainty. Principal Whitcomb approached with a security guard behind her, looking miserable before she said a word. "Mr. Miller," she began, "there may be a concern about the vehicle remaining in donor parking." Harold turned toward her. "Do not tow this car." The principal blinked. Vivian gave a polite laugh. "Harold, really, we can have it brought somewhere safer." He looked back at the Mustang. Then at Ethan. "No," he said, "if this car is what I think it is, moving it carelessly would be the most expensive mistake anyone here has made today." The security guard stopped walking. At that moment, near the registration tent, Vivian's assistant, Mara, froze with a tablet in her hands. She had been checking donor names, but Ethan's face had pulled a memory from somewhere she had tried not to keep. 3 months earlier, he had stood in the service reception area of Cross Elite Motors with the same tired eyes and the same manila envelope. He had asked to speak to someone in the classic division. The department manager had glanced at the Mustang through the glass, laughed, and told Mara to print a basic appraisal form so the man would leave. Mara had remembered Noah, too. Sitting quietly in a plastic chair, swinging his feet, holding a small red toy car, she looked now from Ethan to Vivian and said nothing. Harold crouched once more near the VIN, then shifted his gaze to the inner fender area Ethan had covered earlier. "May I see under the passenger fender lip?" he asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. He looked at Noah, then at the principal, then at Vivian. He understood that the morning had moved beyond embarrassment. If he refused, Vivian would use refusal as suspicion. If he agreed, he would be opening a door he might not be able to close. Finally, he nodded. "Only look," he said. "No scraping." Harold lowered himself with the care of an older man whose knees had earned their complaints. Ethan crouched beside him and pointed without touching the mark. The faded yellow inspection stroke sat beneath old red paint and primer, half hidden, ugly to anyone who expected beauty, beautiful to anyone who understood survival. Harold leaned close. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked at the VIN again. He looked at the fender. Then he looked through the side glass toward the dash and firewall. Vivian's patience broke. "Harold, what exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. He stood slowly. For a few seconds no one spoke. The jazz trio in the courtyard kept playing, cheerful and distant, unaware that a different kind of performance had taken over the parking lot. Ethan could hear Noah breathing beside him. Blake had stopped smiling. Principal Whitcomb was looking at Harold. Now the way administrators look at donors, when they realize the donor may be more important than the problem they were trying to solve. Harold Beckett looked at the rusty Mustang, then at Ethan Miller, the single father everyone had mistaken for a man who brought the wrong car to the wrong place. "This car," Harold said quietly, "was not supposed to exist." This car, Harold Beckett said quietly, was not supposed to exist. The words did not sound loud, but they crossed the parking lot with more force than Vivian Cross's insults ever had. People who had been drifting back toward the courtyard stopped near the donor tent. A few parents turned from the silent auction tables. Principal Whitcomb looked from Harold to the old Mustang, then to Vivian, as though someone had changed the rules of the morning without giving her a copy. Ethan Miller stood beside his son with one hand still resting lightly on Noah's shoulder. He did not look surprised enough for Vivian's liking. That bothered her more than Harold's sentence. A poor mechanic should have looked shocked. He should have looked grateful. He should have asked what Harold meant. Ethan only looked at the car, calm and guarded, as if he had been waiting for someone else to finally see what he had not dared to say. Vivian gave a small, polished laugh. "Harold, you being dramatic," she said. "It is an old Mustang with bad paint and sentimental paperwork. My company sees 20 projects like this every quarter." Harold turned toward her with the patience of a man who had spent a lifetime watching rich people confuse certainty with knowledge. "No," he said, "you see 20 cars that look like this. That is not the same thing." Blake Harlan, who had been enjoying Ethan's discomfort all morning, shifted his coffee cup from one hand to the other. "Are we seriously saying this thing is special because of a faded mark under the fender?" Harold did not look at him. "We are saying no one should speak until they know what they are standing beside." Ethan looked down at Noah. The boy's eyes were wide, not with excitement yet, but with fear. Adults had been fighting around him all morning, and children often understand danger before they understand money. Ethan crouched so they were face to face. "You okay?" he asked. Noah nodded, but his fingers were inside his pocket, wrapped around the little red toy Mustang. Is he saying Mom's car is important? Noah whispered. Ethan's face softened. The Mustang had never technically been Grace's car, but Noah had called it that after Ethan told him Grace would have loved its stubbornness. He's saying, we need to be careful. Ethan said, that is all for now. Harold heard the answer and seemed to approve of it. He stepped closer to the driver's side. Careful not to touch anything without permission, Mr. Miller. I need to ask this plainly. Have you removed the kick panel, the rear seat bottom, or the fender apron tag since you bought it? Ethan shook his head. Rear seat once to vacuum mouse droppings. I saw some markings and put it back. Kick panel is loose, but I didn't want to break the clips. Harold's eyes sharpened. You saw markings under the rear seat, factory crayon. I took a photo, then covered it again. Vivian's arms folded tighter. A crayon mark does not make a vehicle worth causing a scene at a school fundraiser. No, Ethan said, looking at her for the first time in several minutes. But pretending you know what it is does make it worthless either. That sentence landed harder than Ethan intended. For a moment, Vivian had no reply. The parents around them felt the shift and leaned in. Not because they understood cars, but because they understood status. And something about the status of the morning was moving away from Vivian. Harold removed his phone and opened a photo gallery. He did not show it to the crowd at first. He showed it only to Ethan. The image was old and grainy, a scan of a factory lot from the mid-1960s. Rows of early Mustangs sat under a pale sky, some wearing primer patches, some wearing temporary development tags. Harold pointed at one car near the edge of the frame. I have been looking for this pilot batch for 22 years, he said. Most were destroyed, documented, or misidentified. One was rumored to have gone through an engineer's private storage. That rumor died with him. Ethan's grip tightened on the manila envelope. The estate sale was from a man named Walter Greer, he said. Harold's eyes lifted slowly. Walter Greer worked supplier-side body evaluation in Dearborn before he opened his shop. Vivian's face changed before she could hide it. She knew the name. Not well, but well enough. Cross Elite Motors had a research packet on a supposed Greer-linked Mustang sitting in her Classic Division S private showroom. It was not rusty. It was not embarrassing. It was polished under perfect lights, with a six-figure restoration, and a story attached that looked very good in a brochure. Harold turned to Vivian. The car you invited me to discuss today, he said, the one your Classic Division described as the surviving Greer pilot car. Where did your documentation come from? Vivian's mouth opened, then closed. Our archivists reviewed the file. That was not my question. The silence became bigger. Ethan looked from Harold to Vivian and finally understood why she had become so aggressive. This was no longer about donor parking. His old Mustang was standing in the middle of a deal she had expected to control. Blake, sensing danger but not understanding it, tried to laugh the moment back into shape. Well, if this is some collector thing, I'll help everyone out, Ethan. I'll give you $150,000 right now, cash close. You can buy yourself something that starts without prayer. A few parents chuckled nervously, relieved to have a familiar kind of arrogance return. Harold looked at Blake at last. That is not even the price of the transmission history. He said. The chuckles died. Blake's smile froze in place, then fell away. Ethan did not react to the number. No did. He looked at his father with a question he did not know how to ask. Ethan gently took the manila envelope and set it on the Mustang's hood, spreading his palm beneath it so the brittle paper would not scrape against the paint. I have the estate bill of sale, he said. Title transfer, storage unit receipt, a few old photos, and the appraisal from Cross Elite Motors. Vivian's head snapped toward him. What appraisal? Ethan slid one folded page from the envelope and held it up. Your Classic Division looked at it 3 months ago. They wrote it as a tired 1965 coupe. Non-special, project value $1,200. He paused. They also wrote that they declined further inspection. Vivian's face hardened. That sounds like a basic intake form. It does not represent my personal judgment. It has your department authorization on it, Ethan said. I kept it because your manager told me to stop wasting his time. The words were not bitter. They were worse than bitter. They were precise. Around them, several parents looked at Vivian in a new way. Not with outrage yet, but with curiosity. Curiosity was dangerous for people like Vivian, because it meant her version was no longer the only one in the room. From the edge of the crowd, Mara stepped forward before she could talk herself out of it. Her tablet was pressed against her chest, and her face had gone pale. Mrs. Cross, she said softly. Vivian turned with a warning in her eyes. Not now, Mara. But Mara had already crossed the invisible line between employee and witness. I remember Mr. Miller, she said. He came in with his son. He asked if the markings could be checked. Darren told me to print the appraisal so he would leave. Vivian's voice became ice. You are mistaken, Mara swallowed. No, I am not. I logged the form. The parking lot went quiet for the second time that morning, but this silence was different from the sub-silence. That one had been surprise. This one was consequence. Principal Whitcomb looked at Vivian and then at Mara, calculating how quickly a donor problem could become a board problem. Harold held out his hand toward Ethan, not for the title but for permission. Ethan nodded and handed him the appraisal. Harold read it slowly. Declined further inspection, he said. No certification offered, no claim made by Cross Elite Motors. He looked at Vivian. That protects Mr. Miller more than it protects you. Vivian tried to recover by changing the battlefield. Even if this car has interesting paperwork, a school parking lot is not an auction house. Harold, you know better than to encourage amateur fantasies in public. Harold's expression did not move. I do know better, he said. That is why I am going to make the offer properly. He took out his phone and called someone named Elise. When the call connected, he placed it on speaker. Elise, I am at Ashford Preparatory. I need a contingent purchase offer prepared immediately for a 1965 Mustang Coupe, unrestored, possible Greer-linked pilot car, clear title held by Ethan Miller. Offer price $4.2 million, contingent on independent authentication, physical inspection, and clean escrow. Noah's lemonade cup slipped from his hand and hit the pavement. No one laughed. No one moved to pick it up. The number seemed to hang above the Mustang like a weather change. $4.2 million. Not someday, not after a television show, not after a miracle restoration, not after rich people gave permission for the old car to matter. Right there, between the donor tent and the valet lane, from the mouth of the man Vivian had spent weeks trying to impress. Ethan stared at Harold, then at the phone, then at No, Mr. Beckett. He said carefully, I am not agreeing to sell until I know exactly what it is. Harold nodded. Good. That is the first sensible thing anyone has said today. Vivian's control cracked. This is absurd, she said. You have not authenticated it. That is why the offer is contingent. You have not inspected the engine. I have seen enough not to let it disappear. You are undermining a legitimate transaction with my company. Harold's eyes sharpened. No, Vivian. If this car is real, your company tried to sell me the wrong car as the right story. There is a difference. A low murmur moved through the parents. It was soft, but it carried. Wrong car, right story. People understood that even without knowing a single thing about Mustangs. Ethan stepped to the passenger door and opened it. The hinges creaked, making the rich parents flinch, as if the car were still trying to embarrass him. He reached inside and removed the loose kick panel carefully. Easing it past the brittle clips, Harold crouched beside him. Under the panel, half hidden by dust and time, was another mark. A short string of factory grease pencil numbers. Faded but legible enough to make Harold stop breathing for a second. Ethan did not lecture. He did not explain casting dates or pilot procedures or what made a tag right. He simply pointed once and said, Same handwriting as under the rear seat. Harold looked up at the crowd. He did not restore it, he said. He recognized it. That sentence ended something in the parking lot. Until then. Some parents had been waiting for the trick, the exaggeration, the poor man's lucky break that could be dismissed after lunch. But Harold's words made Ethan's quietness look different. It was not ignorance. It was discipline. It was the kind of knowing that did not need to announce itself every 5 minutes. No, saw the adults looking at his father, and for the first time all morning. None of those looks seemed to shrink him. Vivian, cornered by the same public she had used as a weapon, reached for the only power left. Mara, she said, returned to the registration table. Mara did not move. Vivian's eyes narrowed. That was not a suggestion. Harold glanced at Mara. You may want to preserve your records, he said. All of them. Principal Whitcomb cleared her throat. Mrs. Cross, given the circumstances, I think it would be best if the school paused any vehicle removal request. Vivian turned on her Dana. I fund this event. The principal's face reddened, but she held her ground. And I am responsible for the students standing here. That was the first institutional correction. Small, but visible, Vivian heard it and understood the betrayal. It was not heroic. It was not dramatic. It was an administrator choosing at last not to let a child's father be humiliated further for the comfort of a donor. Coach Ruse, Noah's gym teacher, stepped beside Ethan and quietly picked up the fallen lemonade cup. "You all right, Noah?" he asked. Noah nodded, eyes still fixed on the Mustang. Harold ended the call with his attorney and slid the phone into his pocket. "Mr. Miller, my offer stands. 4.2 million, with authentication handled by an independent firm of your choosing, not mine and certainly not Vivian S. You keep possession until escrow terms are signed. No one touches this car without your written permission." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "And if it turns out not to be what you think?" Harold smiled faintly. "Then you still have your car, your title, and my apology." He turned toward Vivian. "And I will still have questions about the car. Cross Elite Motors tried to sell me." Vivian's phone began vibrating in her hand. Once, twice, again, she looked down and saw the name of her classic division director, then a board member, then another call she declined too quickly. News moved fast in wealthy circles, especially when it threatened money. Harold had not even left the parking lot, and already the private deal she had staged for later that afternoon was collapsing. Blake stepped backward, creating distance from the embarrassment he had helped build. Parents who had laughed at Ethan's car now studied it with awkward fascination, as if Rust had become a foreign language they regretted never learning. Harold looked at Ethan. "Does it run?" Ethan gave a tired half-smile. "Rough. Safely?" For a minute. Harold stepped back, then started. Not for proof, for the boy. Ethan understood. He looked at Noah. "Want to hear her?" Noah nodded, and this time he pulled the small toy Mustang from his pocket instead of hiding it. Ethan slid behind the cracked steering wheel. The interior smelled like old vinyl, dust, gasoline, and every Saturday he had spent trying to keep grief from swallowing the house whole. He checked the shifter, tapped the pedal once, and turned the key. The 289 V8 coughed, stumbled, then caught. It was not a perfect sound. It did not roar like a movie car. It idled unevenly. With a faint vacuum hiss Ethan already knew how to fix, and a belt squeak he had been ignoring until payday. But it was alive. The sound rolled across the donor lot and under the white tents. Low and stubborn and impossible to polish into something it was not. Noah smiled before he meant to, the kind of smile that starts in a child's eyes and reaches the rest of the face only after it feels safe. Ethan let the engine run for 15 seconds, then shut it off. The silence after the engine died was the biggest silence of the day. Harold spoke into it. "Collectors are not paying for shine," he said. "They are paying for truth, and sometimes truth arrives with cracked vinyl and bad paint." No one answered. Vivian could not. Blake did not dare. Principal Whitcomb stepped forward, her hands folded in front of her. "Mr. Miller," she said, and her voice carried just enough for the nearby parents to hear, "I owe you, and no, an apology. The school should have handled this differently from the beginning." Ethan nodded once. He did not make her crawl. He did not look toward Vivian to see if the apology hurt her. That was why it did hurt. "Thank you," he said. "No came here for the school event. Not for this." The principal turned toward Noah. "You are welcome here, no, always." Noah looked at his father before answering. Ethan nodded. "Thank you," the boy said. It was small, but it was steady. Vivian removed her sunglasses from her head and placed them over her eyes, a shield arriving too late. Harold faced her one final time. "I am withdrawing from the Cross Elite Motors prototype discussion," he said. "My office will request every document your team provided. If there was a mistake, correct it. If there was more than a mistake, your board should know before my attorneys do." Vivian's jaw tightened. She looked at Ethan as if he had done this to her, as if his old car had ambushed her polished life. But Ethan had not chased her. He had not exposed her with speeches. He had only arrived with his son in the car he owned, and she had made the mistake of laughing before she looked. Mara stood near the registration table, shaking slightly but still holding her tablet. Vivian passed her without speaking. That silence told Mara everything about her future at Cross Elite Motors. Harold noticed. "Ms. Mara," he said, "if you need independent counsel regarding those records, my office can refer someone. No pressure, just protection." Mara blinked hard and nodded. It was another consequence, quiet but real. Vivian was not just losing a deal. She was losing the machinery that let her version of events become everyone else's truth. The crowd slowly broke apart after that, because people can only stare at their own shame for so long. Some returned to the courtyard and pretended to care about the auction baskets. Others lingered near the Mustang, suddenly full of respectful questions they had not earned the right to ask. Ethan answered very few. He placed the appraisal, the estate receipt, and the old photos back into the manila envelope. Harold gave him a card and wrote a private number on the back. "Call me when you're ready," he said, "and choose your own authentication team." "I mean that," Ethan took the card. "Why offer so much before you know?" Harold looked at the Mustang. "Because if I wait until everyone knows, I am just another buyer by late afternoon." The donor lot had emptied. The Lamborghini left first, then the Porsche, then Blake's polished SUV, which now started perfectly because of the man he had mocked. Vivian S. reserved parking sign had been removed by a maintenance worker who kept his eyes down while doing it. Principal Whitcomb had announced a review of event conduct policies and donor privileges before the final student performance. It was careful language, school language, but everyone understood who it was about. Vivian Cross had arrived as the most powerful parent on campus. She left through a side gate, taking phone calls she no longer seemed able to control. Ethan and Noah remained by the Mustang after the tents started coming down. For the first time all day, no one was watching them. Noah climbed into the passenger seat and placed his toy Mustang on the dashboard, directly above the glove box where the envelope had been. The tiny car looked bright against the faded interior. Ethan sat behind the wheel, but did not start the engine yet. He just rested his hands on it. 4 years after Grace, he had learned that good news could be heavy too. Money did not bring back a voice in the kitchen. It did not tuck Noah in at night. It did not erase the years when every bill felt like a locked door, but it could open a few doors now. It could buy time. It could buy breath. It could prove, at least to a 10-year-old boy, that his father had not been small just because others had spoken to him that way. Noah looked at the toy Mustang, then at the real one around them. "Dad," he said, "are we rich now?" Ethan turned toward him. The boy's face was hopeful, confused, and still carrying a little bruise from the morning. Ethan smiled, but not like a man thinking about millions. He smiled like a father remembering Grace at a flea market, holding up a scratched wooden chair and saying, "Value does tea, always arrive polished." He reached over and brushed a bit of dust from Noah's sleeve. "Son," Ethan said, "we were never poor. We just didn't know what we had." Noah thought about that. Then he picked up the toy Mustang and set it more carefully on the dashboard, facing forward like it was leading the way. Ethan turned the key. The old 289 stumbled, caught, and settled into its rough, honest idle. The Mustang pulled out of Ashford Preparatory slowly. Still rusty, still faded, still carrying primer on one fender and history under its skin. This time, nobody laughed, and as father and son drove past the empty donor spaces and out toward the road, the car that everyone had called junk sounded less like an old machine and more like a promise finally being heard.